It started with a phone call, a manager whispering into his headset that there was a suspicious woman loitering in the executive lobby. No shouting, no scene, just a quiet decision to remove her. She wasn't loud, she wasn't aggressive. She was sitting perfectly still, working on a laptop, sipping tea, dressed in a tailored beige suit that somehow made her seem both invisible and in control. But for Preston Hale, the hotel manager at DC's most exclusive five-star hotel, that wasn't enough. Not when she was black. Not when she wasn't wearing a wedding ring. Not when she refused to look nervous. "This lounge is for VIPs only," he said, with a polite smirk that sounded like policy but smelled like profiling. "Do you have a reservation, ma'am?" She glanced up, slowly, with the kind of calm that makes arrogant men nervous. "Do I look like someone who needs one?" she asked, not rudely, not arrogantly, just efficiently. Preston didn't answer. Instead, he nodded to the concierge behind the desk, who discreetly tapped an emergency code into the system. Within minutes, two uniformed officers walked in, straight past the marble bar, past the diamond-lit elevator banks, and toward the only person in the room not holding a martini or a newspaper, her. That's when phones started recording. That's when the viral video began. Body cam footage would later show her sitting still, eyes level, posture upright, refusing to stand. "I don't think you understand who you're dealing with," one of the officers said. Her response was almost a whisper. "Neither do you." What followed wasn't a fight. It wasn't a meltdown. It wasn't even a confrontation. It was a phone call. One number. 10 seconds. And just like that, the same man who tried to have her removed was suddenly receiving a corporate termination notice on his own hotel-issued tablet. The incident would spark headlines around racial profiling in luxury spaces, ignite federal discussions around implicit bias, and lead to one of the most intense internal investigations the hospitality industry has seen in years. But that day, in that moment, all anyone could say was the same thing. Who is she? You're about to find out. But be warned, this isn't a story about a woman being underestimated. It's a story about what happens when the person you're profiling turns out to run the building you're standing in, and this time, there's body cam footage, racial bias, wrongful detainment, and corporate accountability, all wrapped into one phone call that changed everything. Keep watching. She hadn't come to the Varelli Grand to be seen. In fact, Nadira Cole had done everything in her power to remain unseen. That was the point. Her reservation had been booked under a different name, with no digital footprint connecting her to Crescent Holdings, the billion-dollar hospitality empire she helped run. She arrived without a car service, carried her own bag, declined the penthouse suite, and chose instead to sit quietly in the executive lounge dressed like any high-performing consultant passing through D.C. That morning, she blended in on purpose. She wasn't testing them. She was watching them, and by noon, they had already failed. Nadira Cole was not just a C-suite executive. She was the senior director of operations for North America, the person who signed off on every regional manager's performance review, the one who negotiated billion-dollar government lodging contracts and conducted internal audits for compliance and discrimination claims. A Harvard-trained attorney with a background in civil rights litigation, she had spent over a decade dismantling broken systems with precision. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't chase headlines. She believed in something far more dangerous: documentation, patterns, paper trails, data. And today, she was gathering it in real time. This particular hotel, the Varelli Grand in Washington, D.C., was a crown jewel in the Crescent portfolio, a five-star flagship frequented by world leaders, Fortune 500 CEOs, and foreign dignitaries. It was also one of the locations that had, quietly, triggered internal red flags: anonymous reports, unsettled lawsuits, review patterns that pointed to the same problem again and again: guests of color being denied access to certain amenities, questioned more frequently by staff, and escorted out by security on vague suspicions. Nothing conclusive, nothing on paper. Until now. Nadira had entered the building at 9:43 a.m., checked in with an executive access code under the name Monica Bell, and made her way to the mezzanine-level lounge. She didn't ask for champagne, didn't waive status, just logged into the hotel's Wi-Fi and started typing. And yet, it only took 34 minutes for the first microaggression to occur. A passing employee paused, then doubled back and asked if she needed directions. 10 minutes later, a concierge stopped by to ask if she had a scheduled meeting. By 10:40 a.m., Preston Hale, the general manager, was informed that a woman who doesn't seem to match our usual executive profiles was sitting in the lounge alone and hadn't ordered anything. He didn't look at the security feed. He didn't check her status. He just came downstairs. Preston Hale had been with Crescent for 11 years. He'd worked his way up from front desk associate to manager of the company's most prestigious property, and he did so with a blend of corporate charm and passive-aggressive elitism that made him popular with investors and quietly resented by staff. He had memorized the faces of regulars, tipped bartenders to alert him when certain types wandered into the wrong part of the building, and prided himself on keeping the atmosphere clean. He didn't say slurs, he didn't raise his voice. But when Preston saw Nadira sitting in that chair, dressed simply, looking like someone who didn't beg to be accommodated, he made a judgment. She didn't belong. And that's all it took. He walked up with practiced politeness, leaned slightly forward, and asked for her room number. She looked at him, blinked once, and said, "I don't give my personal information to strangers without a good reason." That was enough. He excused himself, went back to the front desk, and began escalating. First to hotel security, then to the local police. The words he used were careful. Unverified guest. Potential loitering. Non-compliant. But the tone was clear. Get her out. What Preston didn't know was that every keystroke he made in the internal system was being monitored. As part of Nadira's covert inspection, her login triggered an audit shadow, an automated system that monitored for racial bias triggers, including inappropriate escalation. The moment Preston added "refuses to verify identity" to the incident report, the algorithm flagged it. And just like that, the people watching him began watching back. Meanwhile, Nadira remained seated. She had already spotted 3 cameras, 2 visible, 1 hidden. She knew where the blind spots were. She made sure she stayed in frame. Her hands remained visible. Her posture was open. She had nothing to prove, but everything to expose. This wasn't about her ego. It was about the system Preston represented. The quiet discrimination dressed up as decorum, the corporate racism masked as policy, and the unchecked authority that turned lobbies into battlegrounds for dignity. What Nadira also knew, but Preston didn't, was that this particular hotel was under review for a $90 million federal lodging contract. A single civil rights complaint caught on video could delay approval for months, maybe years. That wasn't just a PR nightmare. That was a financial earthquake. And now, thanks to Preston's own assumptions, that nightmare was already unfolding. Nadira wasn't just sitting through it. She was documenting it. Every moment was part of the report she intended to file. Every expression, every phrase, every policy misused was being stored, cross-referenced, and time-stamped. The irony was that Preston, in his urgency to remove what he thought was a liability, had unknowingly turned himself into the liability. And the deeper he pushed, the harder the fall would become. The call to police was not a mistake. It was a pattern. Preston had used law enforcement before to handle disruptions that didn't require any intervention. On 2 separate occasions, Crescent's HR department had quietly settled internal complaints tied to racial profiling inside this very hotel. Guests of color described being asked for ID when others were not, being denied access to lounges unless they proved they belonged, or being offered downgraded rooms without explanation. These weren't isolated incidents. They were the echo of a culture built on quiet exclusion, all under the excuse of maintaining brand standards. Nadira wasn't guessing anymore. She had evidence. What she didn't expect, however, was how fast it would escalate this time. Within minutes of Preston flagging her, 2 officers entered through the side lobby, calm, casual, and visibly unprepared for the backlash that was about to hit. One approached her directly. The other stood back, hand near his belt, eyeing her like a potential threat. The optics were bad. A black woman being approached by law enforcement in a luxury hotel lobby over a seating question. Worse yet, other guests were watching, whispering, filming. The hotel was losing control of the narrative, and Nadira hadn't even said a word. She looked at the officers, her expression unreadable, then turned her gaze toward the concierge desk, where Preston stood behind a marble pillar, arms crossed. He thought this would go his way. He thought this would be quiet. He thought power still looked like him. "Ma'am," one of the officers said, "we just need to verify who you are and why you're here." "I'm here," she replied, "because your department is under a federal compliance audit, and now, so is this hotel." The room froze. She wasn't bluffing. Moments later, she tapped a button on her phone. Not a threat, not a tantrum, just a clean, professional command sent to her team. It triggered a protocol known internally as Tier 4 Review, a full operational lock and legal audit initiated when discrimination escalated to potential legal exposure. The hotel's network access to guest footage was immediately disabled. The security feed was redirected to Crescent's internal compliance division, and all digital logs from that morning were frozen under a secure timestamp. Preston had no idea any of it was happening. And still, she hadn't raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her power was embedded in the system. She was the system. Back at Crescent Holdings headquarters, her alert had already pinged 3 departments: legal, risk, and federal contracts. This hotel, like many in the Crescent portfolio, serviced federal employees, contractors, and occasionally even members of Congress. That meant they were held to specific standards: Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, ADA compliance, federal anti-discrimination protocols. A single accusation of wrongful detainment or racial bias in service delivery could trigger reviews not just of one hotel, but of the entire network. And Nadira had just fired the starting pistol. Meanwhile, Preston continued posturing in the lobby, oblivious to the firestorm building around him. He called the front desk and instructed them to print a guest roster, violating privacy policy. He tried to access camera footage, already blocked. He called his regional supervisor, only to be told, "Please wait for instructions. An executive is on site." That sentence broke him. "Who?" he demanded. "Who's here from corporate?" And finally, Nadira stood. She turned to face him, fully, slowly, like someone who had been patient long enough. "I am." Preston laughed, uncertain whether she was serious. "You're from corporate?" "I am corporate," she replied. "I run the operations you just jeopardized, and this is going in my report." He didn't have a comeback, just silence. And in that silence, the truth finally echoed. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't poor training. This was implicit bias weaponized through policy. This was corporate discrimination hiding behind marble and menus, and now it was being exposed. Nadira didn't ask for an apology. She didn't demand respect. She expected systems to work. She expected professionals to act with integrity. And when they didn't, she didn't scream. She removed them, legally, permanently. As she sat back down and resumed her notes, the officers slowly backed away, confused, checking their comms. A notification lit up on Preston's hotel-issued iPad. "Your account has been restricted pending administrative review." Another buzzed. "Temporary suspension initiated." His face went pale. It was over. And she hadn't even started yet. The lobby buzzed with an awkward, suffocating tension. Phones weren't ringing. Voices dropped to whispers. No one quite knew whether to intervene, observe, or vanish, but the damage was already underway. Nadira's presence alone had triggered a complete reversal of control, and every move Preston made from this moment forward would only bury him deeper. Just as he began dialing his personal phone, perhaps to call a legal contact or beg someone higher up for clarity, an alert popped on the concierge screen, visible to anyone behind the front desk. On-site audit activated. Full compliance lock engaged. The words blinked in corporate gray. Below them, a red countdown began. 59:59. It was a timer. A timer that signaled to all executive-tier staff that a federal-level review was now in effect, with mandatory documentation, staff reporting, and real-time monitoring. Preston had unknowingly summoned his own judgment hour. Behind the front desk, a young black staff member named Isaiah glanced nervously at the clock. He'd seen this kind of thing before, racial profiling buried under customer service smiles. He'd even tried to report Preston once when a family from Atlanta was randomly upgraded to a lesser room after checking in late. His complaint never went through. But now, watching Nadira handle everything with frightening calm, Isaiah knew. This was justice being served in real time, and it was wearing heels and a beige suit. Just then, the doors at the far end of the lobby opened. A man in a dark tailored coat stepped inside, clean cut, holding a briefcase, with a badge barely visible at his hip. He scanned the room quickly before approaching Nadira. The moment they locked eyes, it was clear this wasn't a coincidence. He handed her a folder. She nodded. He left. No words exchanged. The folder contained a sealed affidavit from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, confirming prior reports of discriminatory incidents at the Varelli Grand and granting Nadira full legal jurisdiction to collect testimony, documents, and digital evidence on site. Preston saw the logo on the folder and nearly dropped his phone. And the guests had started recording everything. A woman in a green blazer stood by the bar, subtly filming the entire scene for her TikTok. A man on the couch, pretending to read the Wall Street Journal, had uploaded a short video with the caption, "Black woman gets police called on her at 5-star hotel. Turns out she's the boss. This is wild." Hashtag hotel discrimination, hashtag corporate justice, hashtag body cam footage. It took 5 minutes for the clip to go viral. Within 20 minutes, it was being shared on news aggregator accounts. By the time Crescent Holdings' CEO got wind of it, the hashtag #SheRunsTheHotel had already hit the top 10 trending list. Meanwhile, back in the hotel, Nadira pulled out her tablet and tapped into the real-time audit dashboard. Each department in the hotel was now under silent review: housekeeping, food and beverage, security, front desk. Every action taken in the past 72 hours was being logged, and every flagged incident was reanalyzed under federal compliance criteria. Emails were frozen. Internal chats silenced. A single phrase blinked at the top of the screen. Audit level red, pending civil rights review. Then came the next hit. A notification popped up from Crescent Legal. Preliminary risk assessment complete. GM Preston Hale, probable liability. Recommend immediate removal from premises. Nadira didn't even have to lift a finger. 2 security officers, real ones from corporate, approached Preston quietly. No theatrics, no shouting. Just a simple sentence. "You'll need to come with us." To come. Preston froze. "I didn't do anything wrong," he mumbled, his voice cracking for the first time. "I followed protocol." "That's the problem," Nadira said, still seated. "Your protocol is the lawsuit." The phrase hit like a gavel. Your protocol is the lawsuit. Because that's what this was now, a fully documented, potentially class action, racial profiling lawsuit in the making. And Nadira wasn't suing as an individual. She was launching a full-scale investigation through her role as a corporate enforcer, with federal backing and legal authority. As Preston was escorted away, guests stared in stunned silence. Some clapped quietly. Others watched through glassy eyes, unsure whether they'd just witnessed justice or humiliation. For many, it was both. But Nadira wasn't finished. She stood up, faced the staff, and addressed them for the first time. No microphone, no prepared remarks, just steady, measured words. "This is no longer about me. This is about what happens here every day, when no one's watching. When people like me walk in and get treated like problems instead of partners. When you let policy excuse profiling. When compliance becomes optional. Starting today, that ends. Behind her, the hotel's main screen, which normally displayed scenic landscapes and spa offers, flickered. Now it showed a message in bold black text. Crescent Holdings, internal bias training required. Full staff re-education begins tomorrow. The staff looked at each other in shock. No one had ever seen that message go live before. It was only reserved for major compliance breaches, the kind that led to corporate restructuring, mass firings, or worse, federal loss of trust. And still, Nadira hadn't raised her voice. She'd dismantled a legacy of bias using the very policies designed to protect it. And the clock kept ticking. It didn't take long for the media storm to crash through the lobby windows. Reporters began calling the hotel within the hour. Some were tipped off by employees, others by trending footage. A particularly damning clip surfaced showing Preston speaking to police and referring to Nadira as uncooperative and evasive, despite clear video of her sitting silently the entire time. The contrast was stark. The facts were fatal, and in the court of public opinion, the verdict had already been rendered. Crescent Holdings' communications team scrambled to release a statement. It was safe, sanitized, and far too late. The internet had already named the event, the Varelli incident. Thousands of comments flooded Yelp, TripAdvisor, and Google reviews for the hotel. Former guests shared eerily similar stories of being treated as less than or questioned too quickly. Even a retired diplomat posted, "I wasn't asked for ID until I brought my black wife. Then suddenly I was invisible." The story wasn't about a single woman anymore. It had cracked open a much larger narrative: hotel discrimination, racial profiling, and how corporate hospitality often hid behind velvet ropes and legal jargon. Nadira's actions hadn't just exposed Preston, they had forced the industry to confront itself. Meanwhile, Nadira moved with quiet efficiency. She convened a closed-door staff debrief with the department heads. The room was filled with tense silence, not because of fear, but shame. For the first time, managers were forced to look each other in the eye and admit what they'd ignored. The food service director admitted that staff had warned him about a pattern in how guests of color were treated, but he'd dismissed it as anecdotal. The night manager confessed to covering for Preston more than once, even when he suspected bias. None of them had spoken up. Nadira listened, then she spoke. "When you say nothing, you become the policy." She laid out next steps: mandatory implicit bias training, new surveillance audit protocols, a whistleblower hotline that routed directly to her office, and a permanent restructuring of guest evaluation metrics to remove subjectivity from suspicious behavior assessments. She even fired 2 other managers on the spot, one for hiding a prior discrimination report, the other for retaliating against a former employee who raised concerns. But that wasn't the end. 2 days later, Nadira received a notice from the Department of Justice's Office of Civil Rights. Due to overwhelming public interest and multiple prior complaints now corroborated by viral footage, the Varelli Grand was officially being investigated under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act for potential civil rights violations under a federally contracted establishment. This meant that if found liable, Crescent Holdings could not only lose federal lodging contracts, but also face a class action lawsuit on behalf of past guests. It was the nightmare Preston never saw coming, and Nadira had triggered it without lifting her voice above conversational volume. Back online, the internet took Nadira's poise and turned it into iconography. Screenshots of her calmly seated while uniformed police hovered nearby became symbols of resistance. One tweet read, "She didn't raise her voice, she raised the standard." Another, "You profiled the wrong woman, and she rewrote the rules." TikTok creators reenacted the scene. Instagram pages posted comparisons to other infamous profiling incidents at Starbucks, American Airlines, and Ivy League campuses. But this was different. This time, the woman didn't just survive it, she ran it, she changed it. Then came the final blow. Crescent Holdings' quarterly board meeting, normally a low-drama affair, erupted into emergency restructuring. Nadira presented her full report, including a 48-hour timeline of Preston's actions, over 2,000 flagged internal communications using racially coded language, a projected liability cost of $87 million in potential settlements, lost contracts, and brand damage. She ended with a simple conclusion. What happened at the Varelli Grand wasn't a misstep. It was a mirror. And if we don't break the system that made this possible, we will pay for it, again and again. The board voted unanimously to launch a company-wide overhaul of all policies involving security calls, guest interactions, and staff evaluation. Crescent Holdings would now partner with a national civil rights organization to implement third-party oversight and publish annual bias accountability reports. The next day, Nadira returned to the Varelli Grand, not as a ghost inspector, but as herself. As she walked through the lobby, the staff stood straighter, not out of fear, out of respect. Isaiah, the front desk employee, met her at the elevator. "Ma'am," he said, voice a little shaky, "no one's ever done what you just did." She smiled faintly. "No one ever gave me the chance before." He hesitated. "Do you think things will actually change?" She stepped inside the elevator, turned to him, and said, "They already have." As the doors closed, the camera zoomed in on a new plaque being mounted above the concierge desk. It read, "All guests welcome, all bias exposed." The silence returned, but this time it was the sound of an institution being rebuilt. The media moved on after a week. They always do. Viral clips faded into the scroll of newer scandals, shinier controversies, louder hashtags. But for Nadira Cole, the real work was just beginning. What had looked like a single explosive incident inside a luxury hotel lobby was merely the catalyst. A spark designed to detonate something far more permanent, a civil rights infrastructure within the private sector that no one could ignore again. Behind closed doors at Crescent Holdings, the fallout had revealed deeper rot. Through internal interviews and whistleblower tips, Nadira uncovered a quiet web of complicity. Middle managers who had buried guest complaints, executives who adjusted performance reviews based on client fit, and one HR director who had actively discouraged staff from reporting bias for fear of harming the brand. That last one? He was fired. Publicly. But Nadira didn't stop at punishments. She wanted preventive power, a system where accountability wasn't reactive but real-time. So she proposed something radical, the ECR division. Equity, Compliance, and Retaliation Prevention. It wasn't a department with pretty posters and DEI buzzwords. It was a fully funded executive branch with subpoena power, anonymous reporting lines, real-time data dashboards, and external audits conducted by civil rights attorneys, not HR. For the first time in Crescent's corporate history, bias would be logged, tracked, investigated, and, if necessary, punished with the same weight as financial fraud. The board resisted at first. It would cost millions. It would draw unwanted scrutiny. But Nadira didn't blink. She had the leverage. Her quiet threat was this: if you think the viral clip hurt the brand, wait until the next one doesn't end with me sitting in the lobby. Next time it might end in court, and you'll have no one left who knows how to stop it. They voted unanimously. Within 60 days, the ECR division was live in all 180 Crescent properties. Every manager was required to pass bias response training before overseeing any guest-facing role. Every staffer was briefed on the new retaliation protections. And every hotel was now held to civil rights enforcement standards, monitored by a federal compliance expert Nadira had handpicked. Then the twist. As the hotel industry watched Crescent make sweeping changes, two major competitors, both larger, older, and far wealthier, reached out behind the scenes. Not to congratulate her, not to learn, but to threaten her with subtle warnings. Executives whispered to each other that Nadira was dangerous, that she was politicizing hospitality, that her methods made wealthy clients uncomfortable. One even called a journalist off record and said, "She's turning hotels into courtrooms. What happened to luxury being apolitical?" That was the moment Nadira realized. The hotel industry wasn't just biased, it was protecting its bias like a business model. So she made her next move, quietly, legally, but devastatingly precise. She contacted the Department of Justice, not to report wrongdoing, but to offer a partnership. She proposed a civil rights pilot program where Crescent's ECR division would serve as a model framework for federal hospitality contractors. If successful, it could become a standard for every private company that accepted federal travel funding, including airlines, resorts, and convention centers. In exchange, Crescent would receive exclusive federal contracts for 5 years. The DOJ accepted. The news broke a week later. Crescent Hotels awarded landmark federal deal after industry-leading civil rights initiative. What looked like a PR redemption was, in truth, a corporate chess move. Crescent's competitors, furious. One attempted to file an antitrust complaint. Another began rapidly copying Crescent's ECR model, but too late. Nadira had already written the policy blueprint, and she held the copyright. But even that wasn't the final twist. 2 months later, Preston Hale, the disgraced former manager, filed a wrongful termination lawsuit. He claimed defamation, emotional distress, and character assassination. He painted himself as the scapegoat for a company desperate to look progressive. He wanted millions in damages. Nadira said nothing publicly. She didn't need to. At the hearing, her legal team rolled out body cam footage, guest testimonies, and, most damning of all, internal emails Preston had sent over the years containing racially coded language like non-traditional clientele and undesirable energy. When asked under oath what he meant by watch for low-visibility guests, he froze. The court didn't. Preston lost. The ruling was swift and brutal. The termination was not only lawful, it was necessary to uphold corporate accountability, civil rights compliance, and the dignity of protected classes under federal employment law. After the verdict, Nadira issued a single statement. Leadership is not about being loud. It's about knowing when silence becomes complicity. We chose to act. Then she did something no one expected. She donated her entire court-awarded legal reimbursement, not to Crescent, not to her team, but to a foundation supporting young black professionals entering hospitality management. The scholarship was named after her mother, Geneva Cole, who had once cleaned hotel rooms while being ignored by the very guests she now trained executives to serve with equity. By now, the world had stopped watching, but Nadira never cared about the crowd. Her job wasn't to trend. It was to transform. And that's exactly what she did. It was a quiet morning the next time Nadira returned to the Varelli Grand. No headlines, no cameras, no protests waiting at the door. Just sunlight pouring across the marble floor and the faint scent of citrus polish trailing behind the cleaning crew. But the energy had shifted. People noticed her, but not with suspicion, with respect. Not because of what she wore, but because of what she'd rebuilt. The hotel now had a new general manager, a young woman of color promoted from within, standing behind the front desk with her shoulders tall and her tone warm. Guests moved freely through the space, no longer shadowed, no longer questioned. And beneath the surface, systems Nadira had created were quietly doing their job, scanning for patterns, protecting dignity, logging every action so no one could pretend not to know again. She didn't walk through the lobby like she owned it. She walked like someone who had finally made it safe for others to belong there. That was the difference. Nadira never wanted to be a symbol. She never planned to go viral. But when the moment came, when she was profiled, silenced, and nearly removed, she didn't respond with outrage. She responded with strategy, precision, and a kind of quiet authority that rewrites institutions without needing permission. What happened at the Varelli wasn't just about race. It was about pattern recognition. The pattern of assumptions made based on skin color. The pattern of silence in boardrooms when bias is called out. The pattern of thinking that titles belong to one type of face, and that power wears one kind of suit. Nadira didn't just break that pattern. She replaced it with something measurable, something real. She once said, "Reform doesn't happen when we go viral. It happens when the cameras turn off and the policies stay changed. And that's exactly what she left behind. A new protocol, a new generation of leadership, a space that once erased people like her, now run by people like her. Back in her office, far above the city, Nadira kept a framed photo of her mother. Geneva Cole, in a cleaning uniform, smiling through tired eyes in a break room where no one ever learned her name. Geneva never filed a complaint. She never called a hotline. She endured. Because back then, endurance was the only form of justice she could afford. But Nadira had different tools. She had law, she had data, she had leverage, and most dangerous of all, she had vision. To some, she will always be remembered as the black woman who fired a hotel manager with one phone call. But to the ones who understand what really happened, she wasn't just removing a man, she was removing a system. One policy, one audit, one uncomfortable conversation at a time. And the truth is, anyone watching this story, you don't need to be her to do the same. You just need to stop waiting for permission to change what should have never been allowed in the first place.